Hey everyone, it's Megan here from Meghan Makes Do, and today I'm going to show you how to knit the Cordelia cardigan. For this tutorial, we'll be using Lion Brand's Feels Like Butta in the color Dusty Pink. We'll also be using another color later on to add our hearts, but Feels Like Butta is a weight for 100% polyester yarn, but any size 4 yarn should work. You'll also need a set of circular knitting needles. This is what I prefer to use. You can also do this on straight needles if you'd like, but we're going to be using size 7, which is a 4.5 millimeter, and you're going to need 2 different sizes of cords. I use 24-inch and 60-inch. You'll also need a tapestry needle, some stitch markers, and of course a pair of scissors. So let's go ahead and get started. So before I show you exactly how to work up your back panel and your 2 front panels, I wanted to show you that this is what your panels will look like before we even start adding the hearts. We are going to be adding the hearts using duplicate stitch. So the basics of these panels, the back panel, the front panels, they're all the same. We're going to start with this ribbing, and then we're going to work just straight stocking it straight up. We're just making rectangles at this point. So I'm going to show you what it will look like to do these panels using the next front panel. I've only made one so far, and then you can see I've already marked out where the beginning of our hearts will go, but I want to just kind of show you the basics. It's a very simple pattern, great for beginners, and then we're going to add the hearts using duplicate stitch later on. Okay, so using my 24-inch circular needles, I'm going to make a slip knot on my needle, and this is how we're going to start both the back panel and both front panels. So we'll start just by using a regular long tail cast on to cast on the number of stitches indicated for your size. So make sure that you are following along with the written pattern, which you can find for free on my blog, as a PDF in my shop, or as a complete kit from Lion Brand Yarn. So I do recommend following along with the written pattern while you watch the video so that everything makes sense. So just cast on the number of stitches for your size. We will be starting with the ribbing. So again, I'm showing you while making the front panel, but this is the same technique for all. Okay, so now we have our stitches cast on. Now we can start our ribbing. So we're going to start all the ribbing the same. Depending on if you have an odd number of stitches or an even number of stitches, you'll just end a little bit differently. If you've made 1x1 ribbing before, then this will be all familiar to you. But we'll start by just knitting our first stitch and then purling our second stitch. And then we just repeat that all the way across. So knit, purl, purl. If you have an even number of stitches, you just repeat knit, purl till the end. If you have an odd number of stitches, you'll be ending with a knit stitch as well. So just make sure that you are following along for your size and continue working all the way across until all your stitches have been knit or purled. Okay, so I'm working my last stitch here, which for me, since I have an odd number, is going to be a knit stitch, if I can even get that in there. There we go. Okay, and then I'm going to turn my work, and for row 2, this work is a little bit different. If you have an even number, you'll just repeat row 1. So you'll be starting with a knit stitch, knit, purl. But since I have an odd number of stitches, I'm going to start with a purl stitch. So odd number, start with the purl, then knit, then purl, then knit, and we'll do that all the way across, ending with a purl stitch. So your rows 1 and 2 might look slightly different, but basically to start both your back panel and front panels, we're just going to be making 9 rows of 1x1 ribbing. So go ahead and finish up your ribbing, and then I'll meet you back here and show you how to do the rest of the panel. Okay, so here we have our 9 rows of 1x1 ribbing, and now the rest is very easy. This is a great project to just put on a movie or a TV show and work on. But we're going to start our row 1 of our main body of all of our panels are going to be knitting each stitch across. So like I said, this is just a very basic stockinette stitch cardigan that we add the hearts to at the end to give it that extra little oomph. So go ahead and continue to knit across for row 1. Okay, so I'm just working my last 2 knit stitches, and then we can turn, and for row 2 we're just going to purl each stitch all the way across. So yes, we're making just a stockinette stitch all the way up for the basics of our 3 main panels, the back panel and the 2 front panels. Okay, so in our last 2 stitches that we're just going to finish purling here. And then we'll turn again, and we just are going to repeat those 2 rows all the way up until we have 156 rows, and then we will just bind off as we normally would when we are all done. So you're going to do that, get your back panels and both front panels finished, and then I'll meet you back here. Okay, so we want to move on and we want to make our sleeves now, which are made very similarly to how we made the back and front panels. We start with this 9 rows of 1x1 ribbing, and then we're going to be working stockinette stitch again, but this time we're going to be increasing on both sides at certain intervals all the way up. And you'll see when I fold this in half, this is the very beginning of the sleeve, you can kind of see it tapers up. So we're making a tapered sleeve, and we're going to be making increases on those edges every couple rows depending on the size that you're making. So again, please pay attention to the size that you are making, because that will determine how many times you're going to increase and at what interval and what rows you will increase. But you start exactly the same. You'll cast on the number of stitches you need for your size, and you'll work those 9 rows of 1x1 ribbing. Then for the first row of the main body of the sleeve, you're either going to be just working knit across, or you're going to be increasing in that row. But let me just show you how to work the increases, and you can kind of follow along with the pattern as you go. So we're going to knit that first stitch. We're always going to be making our increases on the right side of our work. And then on the right side of our sleeve, we want to do a make one right. We want our stitch to lean to the right. So I'm going to pick up that like strand in between my stitches from the back with my left needle, and then I'm going to knit that stitch in the front just like that. Then I'm going to knit across my row until I have 1 stitch remaining. So on those increased rows, we're always going to be increasing at the beginning and the end of the row. Okay, so we're getting to the end of our row here. I have 1 stitch left, so we have to make our second increase. This time we want our increase to lean to the left, so we're going to make 1 left. And you do that by inserting your left needle into the front of that strand in between and picking it up, and then we're going to knit into the back of the stitch this time. And then we'll just knit that last stitch in our row, and we've just finished one of our increase rows. So then we'll just continue to purl the next row, and then you're going to knit a couple rows, knit, purl until you get to your next increase row. So you will want to make sure that you're following along with the written pattern for your size. I've also included some charts for when you're adding your hearts, but I've also shown where the increases are for your sleeves in those charts as well. So those are all in the written pattern and over on the blog. So make sure that you're looking at those too. Okay, so once you have all of your panels done, so your back panel, 2 front panels, and 2 sleeves all bound off and ready to go, it's time to get to the fun part of adding our hearts. And so we'll be using our color B, which for me, I chose the color Cranberry. And we're just going to want to pull off a long piece of yarn here. I'm trying to remember exactly how many yards I used. I believe it was about 6.5 yards per heart. So it is a rather long piece of yarn, so take your time with this because it can get kind of tangled. But I want to point out that I have stitch markers in place. This is my back panel. And I am following along with the graph that I've made for the Cordelia. And you can see here these colored lines are going to indicate where your size is. So each square is a stitch, and then these vertical lines of color indicate your size. So I'm making a 2X, so that's like the reddish line, and so I'm counting over from that line where my size is, how many stitches I need to go over, and all stitches or all hearts are going to start about 4 rows up of that main panel. So into that 5th stitch from the ribbing, and I believe I'm about 10 or 11 stitches over for my size from the edge. That's where I want to place my stitch marker. That is the bottom of my heart. Then I can count from there. 29 stitches should be in between each heart. So I know when I count 30 stitches across in that 30th stitch, I'm going to place another stitch marker. And I'm going to do that all the way across, following my graph. So I want you to note that, let's say that you're doing a smaller size and your edge or your line comes in a partial heart, you don't need to make that heart. You're only going to be making hearts that are complete hearts. So if the line cuts through a heart, don't make that heart. Just make the solid heart. So for those smaller sizes, you might only have 3 hearts going across the bottom, and for the larger sizes, you'll have 5 hearts going across. So just make sure that you're only making those solid hearts and you're following along, following the graph for your size that you are making. So really take some time to kind of like study the graph and make sure that you're getting everything in the right spot. If you're off by like a stitch or two, it really won't make that big of a difference, but just so you can kind of see how the hearts are supposed to be laid out, I've included these graphs and I explain exactly how we're going to be doing it. And I even say in here, if you have a partial heart on your size, just ignore it. Just do the solid hearts in the duplicate stitch. So I do want to show you now how to actually make the hearts using the duplicate stitch method. Okay, so here I have my stitch marker, and it's in the very first stitch that's going to be the very first stitch of my heart. It's the very bottom stitch of the heart. And so we're going to be kind of working back and forth in rows, increasing on each side, and then we'll be doing like a straight section, and then the last 2 rows of our heart is where we kind of get that final topping piece on each side. So to do the duplicate stitch, I'm going to insert my needle from the back of my work in the very bottom of the stitch that I want to duplicate. And I'm going to pull my yarn all the way through. Like I said, this is a lot of yarn because we want to only have 2 ends for each heart to save ourselves all that weaving in. So I'll leave a little bit of a tail here, and then I can remove my stitch marker. And now to do the duplicate stitch, we're going to go above the stitch that we want to duplicate. So here's the little V of our stitch. I'm going to go through both legs of the stitch above where I'm duplicating. Pull my yarn through, and you don't want to pull too tightly, but also not too loose. It's kind of, you got to kind of figure out your tension here as you go. But that's covering the right side of the V, and then we're going to go back down to where we started, that same spot, to finish up our stitch. And that's going to be the left side of our V. And then you can kind of adjust from there. You can use your needle to kind of pull the yarn a little bit. But there you have completed 1 duplicate stitch. So that's the bottom stitch. So our next row, we want to do 3 stitches. So I'm going to go over to the left a little bit, come up at the bottom of that stitch I want to duplicate in the next row. And then again, going through both legs of the stitch above, I'm going to draw my yarn through there to make 1 side of the stitch. Get all that yarn through. And then go back down where I started. I'm just going to adjust my yarn tail here so I don't have to pull out so much at one time. Okay, and then we're going to go back down into the bottom of the stitch that we want to duplicate to finish up that left side of the stitch. Okay, just like that. Now I'm going to go into the next stitch of that row, so to the right, into the bottom of the stitch. Again, do the same thing, so you're going to stick your needle from right to left through both legs of the stitch above, and then bring it back down into the bottom of the stitch again. So this is quite a long process. Not gonna lie to you, putting the hearts on was probably the longest part of my project, but it is totally worth it, and it is a pretty nice relaxing thing to do. My mom helped me with this actually while I was visiting her, and we just would sit around and we'd watch silly Hallmark Christmas movies and attach all the hearts to the cardigan. So yeah, just try to enjoy the process and the motion of just making these stitches, but that's exactly what you're going to be wanting to do for each row, and we're just going to kind of zigzag across each row. So I've gotten 2 rows done. My next row I'm going to have 5 stitches, then 7 stitches, then 9 stitches, then 11 stitches, then 13 stitches. Then we'll work some straight rows of 13. So I can show you a little shortcut, I guess, as far as not having to pull your yarn back and forth so much, is when you're working like this to go to the next stitch, instead of bringing it all the way down, I'm just going to kind of go down into the bottom of the stitch and then up into the bottom of the next stitch in one motion, so I'm not having to pull my yarn through twice just to get to the next stitch. So I'll show that to you again as well so you can kind of see, but do be careful because yes, you can get some knots as you go. Okay, so let's get this knot out of here, and then I can show you again what I did, that little move I did. It prevents you from having to pull your yarn to the back of your work. You're kind of just working on the front side. So I'm going to go behind the 2 legs of the stitch above like I normally do to start that duplicate stitch, and then when I want to move to finish that stitch, I'm going to immediately go to the spot where I want to start the next stitch. So insert your needle in the bottom of the finished stitch and then bottom of the next stitch over. So you'll just continue to use the duplicate stitch method to add all of the hearts onto your back panel, both front panels, and both sleeves using the graphs I've made for you, and making sure that you're doing the number of hearts for your size. I like to do each set like row by row. So I'll mark a row of hearts, finish them, and then I'll mark the next row of hearts, finish all of those, because it's a lot easier to count from a finished heart than it is without a finished heart. But go ahead and get all of your hearts made onto your pieces, and I'll meet you back here for seaming. Okay, so I've got my back panel and both front panels are done. The hearts are on. Clearly I have not woven in my ends yet, but that's okay. We just want to seam our front panels to the back panel at the shoulders. And I will show you the method I prefer to use, but you can use whichever seaming method you prefer to use to attach your front panels to the back panel. And then once we have the front and back panels together, we will add our sleeves, which I haven't bound my sleeves off yet. I like to kind of wait until I have those front panels on and kind of adjust if I need to. But you will be attaching your sleeve in this manner. The center of your sleeve will be attached to that shoulder seam, and then you'll attach the sleeve down the back panel and down the front panel, just as indicated in the pattern, which you can see here, making sure to attach it evenly on both the back and the front. And you'll do that on the other side as well. Okay, so here I have one of my front panels and my back panel, and I'm going to be using one of the long tails I left after binding off to attach my 2 pieces together. So I use a specific seaming method that makes an invisible seam. But again, you can use whichever seaming method that you feel most comfortable with. This is just the one that I prefer. So we're going to start at the end of the edge of our panels. And here you can see that my long tail is attached to my back panel. So I'm going to start on my front panel. You can see the V's of our stitches here, but we actually want to be going through the upside down V's. So we're going to be going through one leg of one stitch and one leg of the other stitch to start. So I'm going to just be going through this very last part of the stitch to attach initially, and then going through the very beginning part of the back panel stitch just to connect them. And then we're going to look for those upside down V's right there. So I'm going to be going through one leg of one stitch and one leg of the other stitch. Bring it through, and then again looking for that same kind of thing. So I want to go through one leg of one stitch on the back panel as well as like one leg of a stitch on each side. So on the front panel, it's going to look like an upside down V, but on my back panel, the way it's facing me, it'll look like a V. So hopefully this is making sense and you can see how I'm doing it. And then you'll see as I go, I'm just kind of zigzagging back and forth, always bringing my needle from the right to the left. Careful of knots in your yarn. Okay, there we go. And it's kind of just drawing both of the panels together and bringing them in, and it's going to make it look somewhat seamless on that shoulder. And then when I flip it over, you'll see kind of where the beginning, like the bound off stitches that we have, are kind of going to the inside of our work. So here you can see there's our bind off stitches, and those are just kind of getting pulled in, and you can see on the front the seam is pretty much seamless. So I'm just going to continue in that method all the way across, and then I'll repeat that with the other front panel too. Okay, so now that our front panels are on, it's time to show you how I like to attach the sleeves. So I have the center of my sleeve attached to my shoulder seam with a stitch marker. I just want to measure down, making sure that I have the same amount of my sleeve going down the back panel as I do then going down the front panel. So I like to use stitch markers to kind of hold everything in place. Since my pieces aren't blocked or anything yet, they do kind of want to curl in on themselves, but once we start the seaming process, you'll kind of see where to place your stitches, and it should be pretty easy from there. So I like to start in the middle where this the shoulder seam is, and so I use a long piece of color A, and again, just as we did for when we did the shoulder seams, on my sleeve I want to be picking up one leg of one stitch and one leg of another stitch. So I'm kind of picking up those upside down V's on the sleeve, and then I'm going to draw that long piece of yarn through so I have an even amount on both sides, and I'll use one end to seam one side of the sleeve and the other end to seam the other side of the sleeve. That way I don't have to worry about if my sleeves end up kind of being crooked or running out of yarn or anything. Like when I start in the middle, I feel like I get a better connection and a better seam. Okay, so now that I know that I'm in the center, I'm going to remove my center seam stitch marker, and then I'm going to be going through like the edges of the rows of my back and front panels. So I'll kind of keep it loose here at first, not pull too tightly, just so you can kind of see what's going on. But I'm going to weave back and forth like I would for mattress stitch. Again, going in those upside down V's, and then into the edge of my stitch. So I'm kind of picking up those horizontal lines of yarn that you'll see kind of on your front and back panel. And you may have to go through about 1 or 2 of those strands at a time, just so that you can keep it even across, since the number of rows, like the height of our rows and the width of our stitches, are going to be a little bit different. But once I get a couple more stitches in here, you'll kind of see what it will look like. It ends up making a really nice clean edge here. And then the key is just to follow the same line of stitches, I guess, along the front or back panel, so that you have like a really nice line going across. So you can see here, like a nice straight line going down. And then you can kind of pull it tight if you need to, get it a little bit more smoothed out. But it's going to give you a nice, beautiful seam attaching your sleeve. So once I make it down one end, I pick up that other tail of yarn and work down the other edge of the sleeve as well. And then I just leave whatever yarn is left at the end hanging off, because if it's a long enough piece, I can also use that to seam my sides and underarms as well. So just take your time and go slow. Make sure that you're kind of measuring as you go to make sure that you're not, you know, puckering or anything as you're going down. You're keeping your sleeve nice and even along the edge of your cardigan. And then just repeat that on the other side as well, so that until both sleeves are fully attached. Okay, so now our sleeves are on, our shoulders are seamed. We're going to lay our cardigan out and fold it in half so that our arms, the middle of our arms, or I guess the ends of our sleeves where they attach to the cardigan, are lined up to each other, and our side seams are also lined up with each other as well. So kind of get those in line. It'll actually start looking more and more like a cardigan now, but we're going to be wanting to seam from the underarm down to the cuff and from the underarm down to the bottom ribbing. And again, we'll be kind of using a similar seaming technique that we used before, but you can again use whatever method that you prefer. But I'll be using these long strands that I have already kind of in that armpit area to attach both the sides and the whole sleeve from the underarm to the cuff. Grab my tapestry needle, and then I'll start by making sure that I have those bottom ends of our sleeve where it attaches to the cardigan in line with each other, and then I can kind of show you how I like to make this seam here. So I'm trying to start right at that seam as close as I can to it. And then just like we were kind of working into the edge of the row of the edge of the piece when we were doing the sleeve, we're going to work into the edges of each side of the sleeve now too. And you kind of have to unroll as you go. But you can see I'm going through those horizontal bars of our stitches, and I'm making sure that I'm going to be working kind of in that same stitch line all the way down. So you can see I'm going through about 2 horizontal stitches at a time on either side and just zigzagging back and forth. So very similar to mattress stitch. I'm just putting my needle into those horizontal bars. And then you can see it just kind of folds everything in to that center and creates almost an invisible seam for your sleeve. And you'll do the same thing on the sides as well. So just take your time with this. So just continue to seam all the way down your sleeve and your sides, and then repeat that on the other side of the cardigan as well. And then I can meet you back here and show you how to add your collar. Okay, so for our collar, you can see I've started to kind of weave in some of my ends here to get them out of the way, but you're going to want a 60-inch circular knitting needle. Again, we're still using the size 7, the 4.5 millimeter. But you're going to want an extra large cord, since we're going to be going all the way around the entire front edge of our cardigan in order to make our collar. So using color A, I'm going to attach my yarn and pick up stitches evenly all the way around the edge. Okay, so in the written pattern, I've included about estimates of how many stitches you should have at the end, but again, it might vary depending on how many stitches you end up actually picking up. So I'll show you here kind of how I like to pick up the stitches. I usually do, the same number of stitches as there are ribbing stitches. So if there's 9 rows of ribbing, I'm going to pick up 9 stitches along those ribbed edges. But we're just inserting our needle through the edge, yarning over and drawing up a loop. And we're just evenly picking up stitches all the way around. I tend to skip every like 3 or 4 row edges or rows, just because my stitch gauge and my row gauge are different, and I don't want to have too many stitches picked up where my cardigan edge then is wavy. Same as you don't want to pick up too few and have it pulling and shortening up your cardigan and kind of looking funny in the front. So it can take a bit of practice to get this exactly right, but you can see I'll pick up probably 3 rows and then skip the next row all the way along the edge here of like the main body of the cardigan. And then when I get to that neckline, I just pick up the number of stitches that are along the neckline. So there I'm skipping 1 row, and then I'm going to pick up the next 3 rows, 1 stitch in each row, obviously, and then skip the next one. So there's 2. So I'll pick up a stitch in the next row, and then I'm going to skip 1. So this just helps me ensure that I'm getting a nice number of stitches picked up, and that it's not going to be too loose or too tight in the end. But just continue to pick up stitches all the way around your cardigan until you get to the other side at the end of that ribbing. Okay, so I've made it all the way around my cardigan, and now we're just going to be doing a 1x1 ribbing, starting with a knit stitch. So I'm going to knit 1, and then purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, and I'm going to do this all the way across until I get to the other side. And then depending on if you have an odd number or even number of stitches, you'll either start your next row same as this one, knit, purl, or you'll start with a purl and then knit. But you can follow along with the instructions in the written pattern as well. But we're just going to be doing a total of 8 rows of 1x1 ribbing for our collar. Okay, so then once I have my 8 rows finished, it's just time to bind off. You can use whichever bind off method you prefer. I just go ahead and do the normal bind off, just keeping with those same stitches. So my first stitch is a knit stitch, so I'm going to knit the first stitch, purl the second stitch, so keeping with my pattern, and then I'm going to move my yarn to the back and bind off. And then my next stitch is a knit stitch and bind off, purl the next stitch, and then bring my yarn to the back and bind off. So I just like to continue to follow that 1x1 ribbing pattern as I bind off all of my stitches. And then of course when I get to that last stitch, I can just pull the yarn through and weave in any remaining ends. And then I do like to give the cardigan a nice block, especially with the duplicate stitch. You'll really want to either steam block or wet block this one, just so that those hearts are laying nice and smooth for you. I hope that you enjoyed following along with this tutorial, and I hope that you love your brand new Cordelia cardigan. Again, you can find the written instructions through the links in the description below. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more.